My name is Webster Tarpley, and I would like to offer a kind of synthesis of a talk which I just gave here in New York City at the 2014 Left Forum at John Jay College on the west side of Manhattan. We had a very well-attended session, I think one of the best attended of any of the, let's say, non-foundation funded ones. But unfortunately, our technical ability to provide the taping of it let us down. So let me try to summarize this. My topic is restarting history after a quarter century of globalization. And the idea of this is, you probably remember at the time about 25 years ago when Francis Fukuyama and others came forward and talked about the end of history. Well, my theory is that history may have seemed to stall, at least for some people, certainly never ended, and now it's back with a vengeance. It's rolling along. Now, my first point, though, is to bring you some good news, and especially good news that maybe Amy Goodman forgot to tell you about on her Democracy Now! Program. The Syriza Left Party, the Left Union of Greece, in these European elections, the results of which were announced 1 week ago, has now become the biggest political party in Greece. And this simply means that when we have the next parliamentary election in Athens, the Syriza party is very likely to emerge as the largest single party. And the way the Greek system works is that there's a majority bonus. The Syriza party is likely to take over the government, and Alexei Tsipras is going to become the Prime Minister of Greece. This is an earth-shaking event. It will be the first time that an anti-austerity, anti-bailout, and we could say anti-speculator government has emerged in Europe in our time. It's also the first time that a left party has become the absolute majority, or at least relative majority, in Greece. This means that the Merkel European Central Bank regime of killer genocidal austerity is going to be under heavy attack. So I want to urge everybody to join in, and this is of course Tsipras, the man of the hour in many ways, deserves a round of applause from all of us for being able to break this monopoly of the pro-bank politicians and actually to offer an alternative. So don't listen to people who have some right-wing or ultra-left quibble against Tsipras. This guy is the way to go. Now, the topic of our discussion here today at the Left Forum, the theme of the whole conference, is reform and or revolution. And I would just like to say, this is one time when the canard about dialectical unity really does apply. Reform and revolution, from the point of view of the masses, Joe Sixpack, are the same. Joe Sixpack doesn't care whether it's reform or revolution. Intellectuals may care, but the masses don't care. The point is this. Let's assume you have a program of mass traction economic demands, things that have to do with the life or death needs of working families. Let's assume that those reforms appear as fair, necessary, good, urgent to the average person. Let's assume also that those same reforms destroy the power of the Wall Street predatory zombie bank financial elite. If you have that, you've got a revolutionary situation, something that looks like a reasonable reform to the masses, which is a deadly challenge to a bankrupt and degenerate ruling class. That's what you've got to aim for. There are large periods of world history where there are no such demands. But we, thank God, are now in a period when there are such demands. They're generally summed up under two headings. One is the Wall Street sales tax, a 1% tax on all Wall Street turnover and derivatives in particular. This not only breaks the power of Wall Street in a political sense, but provides adequate revenue for the government to do its work. The fiscal crisis of the federal government and state governments in the United States are due almost exclusively to the fact that Wall Street pays nothing. No federal income tax, corporate income tax, and no sales tax of the kind that we all pay on our daily necessary purchases. Wall Street just doesn't pay that. So the Wall Street sales tax and the demand to seize the Federal Reserve and issue tranches of trillions of dollars of 0% long-term credit for infrastructure, agriculture, manufacturing, and all kinds of productive economic activity that can bring on an economic recovery. So therefore, there is no metaphysical distinction, right? Kant might discover one, but for the rest of us normal guys, reform grows into revolution if the reforms are radical and competent enough. Now, one of our themes also today is the warmonger left, the foundation-funded left, the purveyors of color revolutions and apologists for State Department policies, including the infamous responsibility to protect, otherwise known as humanitarian bombing. We wanted to focus in particular this year on Amy Goodman, once again, and Code Pink. Amy Goodman, because she has almost completed her process of destroying the Pacifica network, sucking all of the resources into her own capacious pockets, and crowding out any other honest alternative, or indeed more radical alternative. So we see that Amy Goodman looms very large this year at the Left Forum, and we feel that this is an index of the crisis in which this entire political system is now to be found. The goal that they have is to provide a pseudo-opposition to the State Department, where they claim to be against the State Department, but through some strange coincidence, the enemies of the State Department are exactly the targets of Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman. Now, where are we in all this? I want to advance this comparison of the 1848 revolutions in Europe. In 1848, as you may know, the Mazzini networks and a few other networks were able to overthrow every government in continental Europe. Louis-Philippe of France, Metternich of Austria, on and on, all of them. Russia not, England not, but everything in between was overthrown. Let's compare that to the Arab Spring of 2011. They have a lot in common because both were essentially the products of British, or in this case, Anglo-American intelligence. In the period going up to 1848, as in the period going up to 2011, there's a proliferation of illusions, chimeras, self-deluding prophecies, simply wrong ideas. And what these lead to is a series of failed revolutions that don't really advance any useful cause. There are a couple of exceptions in 1848, right? The ending of serfdom in Central Europe. But other than that, not what people wanted. And now we look at the aftermath of the color revolutions, the Arab Spring, and we'll see that most of these places are infinitely worse off than they were. And it turns out that the romantic illusions of the golden youth of Tahrir, or the revolution so-called in Tunisia, not really a revolution at all, is to cover the activity of who? Of the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Endowment for Democracy, the political parts of USAID, Freedom House, Gene Sharp, and the Otpor group, which is a kind of subcontractor of the CIA, to unleash these anti-authoritarian, I would say Oedipal, cultural color revolutions. The mental map of all this is, you start with the idea of the golden youth protesting in the square, right, from Kiev to Cairo or whatever it is. The golden youth want freedom, democracy, they want the internet. Unfortunately, they also want neoliberal free trade, free market, and other demands, the abolition of subsidies, that tend to be very bad for working people, for the farmer, for the peasant, for the worker, for the tradesman, the small shop owner, petty bourgeoisie, whatever it is. People like Zuckerberg and Brin and Ghonim of Egypt have no idea of what the masses actually need, and they have no demands that go in that direction. So therefore, their revolutions in the Middle East have tended to be taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood. And when I say Muslim Brotherhood, we're talking about an organization that has been in a firm alliance with the CIA for many decades, right back to the 50s, when the head of the Muslim Brotherhood was received at the White House by President Eisenhower, the idea being that he would work to overthrow Nasser of Egypt. So the idea that any revolution is a good thing is a farce. What if the Golden Youth have been duped by the CIA into targeting and overthrowing some leader, a Gaddafi, even a Mubarak, that the CIA wants to dump? And we see that in Ukraine today. We see where this leads. There's also the problem of national self-determination. This assumes that nations are self-evident and that the demand for their freedom is automatic. It's not. That comes from Lenin, Woodrow Wilson, and it's got to be evaluated under every specific case. For example, I would argue Ukraine is not a country. It's useless to talk about their self-determination. There's no country there, and there never has been. Now, as we make the transition from the pre-1848 or the pre-2011, one of the key ideas that comes around is, how do you actually accomplish progress? And the point is, you got to take progress wherever and whenever you can get it. And often, you got to open your eyes to the fact that sometimes the most progressive regimes available in reality at any given time are precisely the ones that are being targeted for being authoritarian. From Gaddafi, say, back to Bismarck. Let's try Bismarck as an example. Here's Otto von Bismarck, right? Obviously, very bad guy in the Anglo-American history world, and would be called an oppressor by Marxists and so forth. But let's look at a few things that he actually accomplished. He invented and institutionalized for the first time what we call Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So that Germany from the 1870s on has a system of public-private health care, which we still do not have in the United States, because it includes anybody who has a job and well beyond. Bismarck is also somebody who supported protectionism, dirigism, mercantilism, against the British free trade doctrine. And this was the only way that Germany was lifted out of backwardness and immiseration in the second half of the 19th century. In foreign policy, Bismarck was a friend of Lincoln, a friend of Grant. He opposed the Confederate slaveholding conspiracy or rebellion here in the United States. Bismarck is also somebody who rejected colonialism. He said, I don't want to acquire territory in Africa or anything of the sort. Another important point is that once Germany's national unity was attained, he practiced war avoidance. And one of the main ways he did it was to ally with Russia against the British and the French, who were the main aggressors in Europe at the time. So all of this goes together we get this concept that after 1848, there's a new toughness of mind, a new dimension of realism. And it's often called Realpolitik, just means the policy of realism, or a policy based on reality. And I think it shows us that after that horrendous experience of the Arab Spring and the color revolutions, it's time to adjust the way we look at these things away from a kind of naive, romantic view into something more realistic. There are just a few more things about Bismarck, so you get the idea. If you don't study him, you don't know who this was. You've often heard on the Sunday morning talk shows that politics is the art of the possible. Well, it's Bismarck who said that. The key concept we need is the speech where he says, in 1848, 1849, people believed that they could change the world exclusively by speeches and majority votes. And he says, that turned out to be a fallacy. We're now in the age of blood and iron. And I'm afraid that we are, in our world too, here in 2014, we're entering into the age of what I would call a bit more blood and iron than most people realize. And remember, when he talked about war avoidance, he's got this amazing quote where he says, Europe is a powder keg, and the leaders are like men smoking in an arsenal. Doesn't that sound like what we've seen today in the Ukrainian conflict? A single spark will set off an explosion that will consume us all. I cannot tell you when the explosion will occur, but I can tell you where. Some damned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off. Doesn't that sound like Ukraine or something in that direction between Ukraine and the Middle East? Another good Bismarck quote is, preventive war is like committing suicide for fear of death. I don't think the neocons would have liked that one, since that was their doctrine. So I would say the following are the lessons of the failed pseudo-revolutions of the Arab Spring. We're in a world economic depression. It's brutal, it's getting worse, and it won't end until policy changes are made, I think in the way that I've tried to suggest. This world depression means that nation states, and indeed civilization itself, are in grave danger, and they are vulnerable to attack by the CIA. The essence of the CIA policy is break up nation states, go for mini-states, micro-states, failed states, rump states, warlords, chaos, anarchy. That's the worldwide line of the Anglo-American secret intelligence world. We also have to remember, if you want to have democracy and the rule of law, and I do, you've got to understand these require a material basis in terms of standard of living. As Roosevelt said in the Atlantic Charter, specifically in the part on freedom from want, August 1940, needy people cannot be free people. He put it, necessitous men cannot be free men, but needy people cannot be free people. That is absolutely correct. The CIA says human rights can flourish in an atmosphere of absolute poverty, degradation, and destitution. It's simply not true. And therefore you've got to realize that the choice in much of the world is between an authoritarian government with good policies, sometimes, and chaos. And that ultimately, when it gets down to it, just about any state is better than no state. Any kind of law and order is probably going to be better than absolute chaos and anarchy. The other problem that we face now is the inherent difficulty of getting through to 2014, 2015. We are looking at the end of the era of total unipolar US domination of the world. This is a time which began around 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it seems to be ending as we speak here in New York City in the very end of May 2014. Now, if we look back, the idea of a power that has dominated the world, and especially a unipolar world, this has not occurred a lot, but whenever it has started and ended with wars. And therefore we've got to think about how do we avoid this. Just a couple of examples. Spain, together with Portugal, dominated the world pretty much from 1525 to 1659. That's from the Italian Wars to the end of the extended 30 Years' War. And at the end of that, Spain-Portugal was, by that time they'd split, pushed aside by France under Louis XIV. France dominated the world from 1659 to 1713. That's the War of the Spanish Succession and the Peace of Utrecht. And at that point, the British take over, and the British keep going from 1713 to 1940. 1713 to 1940, in the midst of World War II. And that's a long period of world domination. That tells us a lot about the problems of the world in their relation to the British imperial system. And this is a serious matter. But in this long stretch of British relative domination, there's a period of absolute unipolar British domination, which is from this fateful 1848 until about 1871. It's about 23 years. And it starts with all those governments being overthrown, as I said before, and it ends when Bismarck unites Germany and Lincoln defeats the Confederates so that the United States is going to survive. The Russians also are able to defend themselves in the Crimean War. But in that period, when the British are grasping for absolute uncontested world domination, we got 3 Opium Wars against China, Crimean War against Russia, Sepoy Mutiny in India, US Civil War promoted by the British, French in Mexico, and on and on. There is then a time when the German Reich seems to be the dominant power in the world. That's about 1940 to 42 or 43. But then it's the US. So the United States has tended to dominate the world from 1943 on. That's a relative domination because the Soviets were there and they were formidable, make no mistake. But then we get this period of unipolar dominance, right? Absolute world preeminence. And that's really from 1991 to 2014, 23 years. Hey, have we discovered a 23-year rule? The British unipolar absolute domination, 1848 to 1871, 23 years, and then the US domination, 1991 to 2014, 23 years. Could be an interesting thing. The problem, though, beyond the interest, is that these begin and end with wars, often world wars. So we've got to promote war avoidance at all costs. Now, this idea of the end of history, right? This is a favorite thing from the neocons, but it's broader than just that. Daniel Bell at Harvard, even in the 60s, was arguing the end of ideology. I'm afraid ideology has not ended. There's still a lively debate, and you're going to see it get more lively. Fukuyama, we're going to look at in a minute, the end of history. How about Jessica Matthews, today a leading warmonger? Her essay, Power Shift, from the late 90s, says that the post-1648 nation-state is doomed, and it's going to be replaced by non-governmental organizations and by worldwide speculative hot money and zombie bankers. And I'm afraid all of that is garbage, but you got to understand this is what the ruling class still thinks. And all the people who built their career on this are they're trying to extend and prolong the reign of this illusion. In particular, Fukuyama, here's Fukuyama. He's the ideologue of the Bush 41 administration. And you'll remember what he wrote. The triumph of the Western political idea is complete. Its rivals, the Soviets, have been routed. Political theory is finished. The Western idea of governance has prevailed. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The modern American state is the final rational form of society and the state. Now, this was nonsense. This was pernicious, absurd, as soon as it was written. But they've been going with this for 25 years. They've been trying to make it stand up, and they still are. He also says, by the way, the end of history is a very sad time. So if you found that the last 25 years was rather rough personally, maybe you can look forward to something better now. And now Jessica Matthews. This is interesting because you can see the relation between her career, built on this power shift, end of the modern state essay, and what she wants today. Look what she wants. She says, it's time to send 1 U.S. brigade to Ukraine. Anybody who tells you nobody wants boots on the ground, tell them they're crazy. This is the Carnegie Endowment, the Harvard Corporation. This is a ruling class figure of some note. She wants 1 U.S. brigade, 4 or 5 battalions from NATO countries. That makes another brigade. My God, she wants 1 division, 2 brigades, in Ukraine. This is to court thermonuclear war and Armageddon, and it's a bad idea. So here's my first point. We have a clinically insane ruling class. Don't ever lose sight of this fact. John Forbes Kerry of Skull and Bones. Last year we noted his Syria policy was based on cannibals, terrorists, rebels. And now he's got Ukrainian Nazis and Ukrainian neo-fascists. So I think it's time to send him to the Skull and Bones funny farm. Then we've got General Petraeus. When Kerry wanted to start attacking Syria a couple of months ago, get going again, he brought in Petraeus. Now, Petraeus embodies the notion of a military dictatorship here in the United States, the Bonapartist coup. This is the stock in trade, I think, of General Petraeus. So another madman. And of course, such charming ladies as Victoria Nuland and Samantha Power. Victoria Nuland with her foul mouth, and the loopy Samantha Power who wants to have humanitarian bombing. Let's not forget, in the middle of all this, Anne Marie Slaughter from Princeton Woodrow Wilson School, the State Department. She says, don't attack Putin in Ukraine, he's too strong there. Attack Putin where he's weak. Bomb Syria, you can get Putin that way. So we're dealing, again, with a clinically insane, bankrupt, decadent, degenerate ruling class that have to be gotten rid of. And now, you have to indulge me, I've said that ideology is not over. Ideology is here, and it revolves around these issues, so let me just enumerate them. You look at the people that I've just shown you, we can say that they are typical of the late imperialist phase of ideological decadence. And what can we say about the quality of their thinking? What's the philosophy that they espouse, whether they know it or not in practice? Well, irrationalism, relativism, intuition, radical subjectivism, and the rejection of reason, reality, objectivity, science, progress. These are people who embrace mysticism, existentialism sometimes, pessimism certainly, vulgar materialism when it's needed, ochlocracy, mob rule, superstition, Malthusianism, they want genocidal anti-industrial policies, elitism, and narcissism. That's sort of a category of key words, what's wrong with these people. So we can say that there's a rebirth of ideology, and certainly the idea that fascism is back. Fascism is now a live issue, a hot issue in Central Europe. We have Nazis, we have fascists. We've got them in Lvov, Ukraine, in Kiev, Ukraine, and we've got Western European neo-fascists. We've got Marine Le Pen with her 25% of the French vote. Farage in England, not much different. And Grillo in Italy with his pseudo-left five-star movement. These people are all at some point along the proto-fascist to fascist kind of scale. Just a couple of words about where this has left much of the world, right? Libya, for example. Gaddafi, much targeted by the Anglo-Americans. Remember, he brought Libya to the highest point of any African country in the Human Development Index and built the great man-made river, the biggest civil engineering project anywhere in the world at the beginning of this current century. And the Anglo-Americans wanted him assassinated. Now they got their wish. Who's going to be the head of Libya? It looks like it's going to be Khalifa Haftar. This is a CIA butcher. He spent 20 years as an American citizen living near CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. He is the boss of the February 22nd Martyrs Brigade. Those are the people, remember, who were supposed to defend the Benghazi U.S. compound and Ambassador Stevens, who were pulled out, and other killers then went to work killing the people that were there. Haftar will now become the dictator of Libya, by all indications. So you tell me, who's better? Is Gaddafi better or Haftar? And if you're going to start supporting revolutions, you damn well better have an idea of the consequences and take some responsibility for that. Now here's another part of Gaddafi. You can see this map. We have the Sahara, we have the Sahel. One of the things about Gaddafi was that he was a Pan-Africanist and he took it seriously. And you see these countries, they've all been destabilized, right? Be it Mali, Niger, Chad, Central African Republic, Northern Nigeria, right? Boko Haram. Libya was a factor of stability in all those areas. It was a factor of investment, modest though it was, There was food production and other medical care and other things that Gaddafi was providing as part of his ideological offensive. Now, Libya has become the opposite. It's become a source of guns and weapons out of Gaddafi's arsenals that are now being used to destabilize this vast area. So genocide in the Sahel is something that has been accelerated by the overthrow of Gaddafi. Let's look at Syria. Assad, right, one of the most hated by the Western media. What is this guy? He's a doctor from London, speaks English, has a rather nice-looking wife. What is this thing? Well, they want him out for geopolitical reasons. He's harder to demonize, though, than Saddam Hussein. Many positive features with him. The main one is he's not chaos. He's not anarchy. He represents some kind of society. And this past weekend, he's been, I believe, re-elected for another term as president of Syria. It's funny, the US says you can't have an election in a war. In Ukraine, you can have an election in a war, but in Syria, of course, you can't. Well, what's the alternative to Assad? This guy here, what he's chewing on is a human heart. He's just cut it out of a dead victim enemy, and he's eating it in front of the camera to show what a tough guy he is. So you tell me, the former London ophthalmologist speaking English and relatively calm, if you've seen him, or this fanatical lunatic cannibal. Egypt, this is another good one. President Nasser, I believe, was the most formidable adversary of imperialism in the 50s and 60s. You can see how much he was targeted. I believe actually Nasserism is the natural form of government for Egypt. It's authoritarian, sure, but let's look at the benefits. He nationalized the Suez Canal and used the tolls to build the Aswan High Dam. The Aswan High Dam is the cornerstone of modern Egypt. Flood control, malaria control, hydroelectric power, everything depends on the Aswan High Dam. And that's Nasser. That's what he fought for. And then, of course, the question was, instead of having a single Nile, he was beginning to think about a second Nile going off sort of to the northwest. That has been left undone. The Muslim Brotherhood opposes these great projects. The Muslim Brotherhood wishes to keep Egypt in that backwardness and immiseration. Now, President Sisi of Egypt is endorsed by Putin. This ought to mean something. He has been campaigning in the election, which I think he's just won, on the basis of infrastructure and jobs. In particular, Sisi's main point was 1 million modern housing units, in addition to the 1 million modern housing units already started, and 800,000 units per year after that. The Muslim Brotherhood is opposed. The Muslim Brotherhood is allied to the CIA. Here we have Sisi meeting Putin. This is the kind of cooperation that I think is promising. And here we have Hamdin Sabahi, who ran against Sisi. I would say, happy is Egypt. They have two guys running for president who are actually both qualified to be president. Here in the US, we have nobody in the major parties who's qualified. Sabahi got 21% in 2012. His idea is develop the state sector, and he wants a 10% Tahrir tax on the fortunes of rich Egyptians over $8 million. He says it's a one-time tax to try to help the country going. Now, how do our dear friends, the foundation-funded leftists, respond? Here's Code Pink at the State Department this past week. This guy is supposed to be General Sisi, and the lines were, oh, I'm General Sisi, I'm here in Foggy Bottom at the State Department, and I'm here because they pay me, they support me. Well, they don't. It's just crazy. It's just factually wrong. If anybody's followed anything about Ambassador Patterson and all of the conflicts that have gone on, the Egyptian patriots say that the US promotes terrorism in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And remember, the last thing that Morsi wanted to try to do was to attack Ethiopia because they were building a dam, and he wanted to send the Egyptian army to fight against Syria in the name of the Muslim Brotherhood against Assad. So I think at that point, a coup d'etat became not just admissible or formally, legally okay, but absolutely necessary and right away. Now, Iran is hated. I would just point out the thing that the US and the British want to attack most is the right of all nations to peaceful nuclear energy, atoms for peace. And we have to remember, if you don't have the full nuclear fuel cycle, you do not have a full set economy, you're not an independent country. And that is what Iran is trying to assert. Now here's another one. It's too early for me to evaluate Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, but I can tell you based on his speeches what he thought voters wanted. And he talked about being Mr. Development. He talked about rural electrification, the kind of stuff that we had here under the New Deal in the 1930s, economic development, infrastructure, superhighways, railroads, fast rail, power grids. That's what India wants, and that's the biggest election in the world. So doesn't that tell us something about what the people of the Third World want? And I have to say, if you're a radical chic New York leftist and you don't like that, maybe you ought to check your own conscience and your own moral compass. The big problem, though, even bigger than, more urgent maybe than any of these, is the color revolutions have advanced us down the road towards World War III. In the Ukraine, we've got an immediate potential for thermonuclear war. On the one side, we've got Polish NATO troops, perhaps, that might intervene in the Ukrainian civil war, and on the other side, Russian forces. Both sides may therefore have nuclear weapons, the NATO, US, French, British nuclear force, and then the Russian on the other. And I must ask people to prepare emotionally as well as politically for choices here that you have not seen since October 1962. What will you do if a general war with Russia breaks out? How will you try to put an end to that unfortunate, intolerable situation? The Washington Post has published this overview of the forces. The interesting thing about the Ukrainian army is that it won't fight for its own country, or has not so far, really, in any serious way. The Russian supremacy there is overwhelming. This is no affair of the United States. This is time to butt out. And also to say, well, if the Russians have been repeatedly attacked by land from Central Europe, if they've seen what Nazism and fascism mean, and if they're concerned about keeping some warm water ports ice-free, then I think you've got to grant them some sphere of interest in this and give them what they can reasonably want. Ukraine, it seems to me, is a radically divided congeries between the Lvov, Western-looking Roman Catholic people in the West and the Russian Orthodox, Russian-speaking people in the East. I don't see how this can be held together. It just can't be done economically. It's not viable, as Rosa Luxemburg might say. This shows the language breakdown. The darker the color, the more the Russian language is prevalent. You get the idea. Kiev is a Russian-speaking city. Odessa is a Russian-speaking city. So draw the conclusions. Remember also that Ukraine is an artificial country, right? Instead of having Jefferson and Franklin and Washington, this is the foundation of Ukraine. It's the 9th to the 10th of February, 1918. And the German General Staff has created Ukraine out of territory that they conquered from the Russian Empire. And what's the price of Ukraine? What is it that Germany wants in order to support the independent Ukraine? It's 1 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef, manganese, and linseed oil, a whole bunch of other things. This is the first time on a map, more or less, that you see Ukraine as the name of a country. New York Times, February 1918, carved out of European Russia is this Ukrainian entity. And, well, there it is. It's never existed before that. Ukraine has existed as an independent country, maybe, independent really never, but semi-independent for it's about 25, 26 years. and they have never mastered the arts of governing themselves. Here are the founding fathers of Ukraine. Starting on the left, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who brought Hitler into power. On the right, we have General Ludendorff, who helped Hitler with his Munich beer hall putsch. And in the middle, General Skoropadsky, a Russian general who was made the head of a Ukrainian puppet state by the German general staff. And again, his duty was deliver this food because the Germans were hungry. So that's where it comes from. Before this, it never existed. Here you get a map. This is a Spanish language map, but you get the idea. The Ukrainian part around Lvov and a little bit east of that. This is also where the white armies came from, Denikin, Kolchak, Wrangel, and the lunatic anarchist Nestor Makhno, whose famous slogan was, "I destroy everything, you guys clean it up, you can rebuild." And of course we come to Putin. He's widely hated by Western elites. He's hated by left liberals too. He has taken away the color revolution to some degree, and he's taken away the humanitarian bombing, which are the favorite means that the Anglo-Americans use to try to reorganize the world scene. You know, in Hegel, there's this notion that Hegel saw Napoleon ride into Jena, and he said, "I just saw the Weltgeist on horseback." What it means is that certain historical transitions seem to be the handiwork of individuals. That's probably a mystification, but you get the idea. For many people, Putin is the symbol of a shift, that the US cannot be allowed to run wild all over the world in this unilateral way, and he has established some kind of a barrier, and I think that's beneficial. Now here's the problem with Putin. We're not in the adulation business, so we got to talk about what's Putin's problem. The post-Yeltsin compromise in Russia is what? It's if the oligarchs allow Putin to govern the country and don't try to engage in a coup, then they're allowed to set the tone economically to a very large degree. This is the post-Khodorkovsky form of this. Remember, in November 2003, the richest oligarch in Russia tried to organize a coup, and Putin put him in jail, and he only just got out. But that's the compromise. Now, the Ukrainian emergency puts a tremendous strain on that compromise and undermines it. And the division that we're going to see is the Siloviki against the liberals. The Siloviki, we'll see it in a minute, are the power ministries, the army, the KGB, the secret police, people with guns, right? People with that kind of power. And the neoliberals are a faction left over from the IMF World Bank shock therapy of about 20 to 25 years ago. And they're a pro-Western faction, really incompatible with the future of Russia. Okay, President Xi and Putin. This is the $400 billion gas pipeline deal. $70 billion in pipeline and other infrastructure up front. I would submit to you, this is the face of human progress in the form that we can attain in our time. This is what the world should look like. It's not perfect, but it's a whole lot better than what's going on in Libya, where civilization is collapsing into absolute chaos. And what it shows, I think, the whining response of the US elite, is that the US elite is, as I said before, degenerate, decadent, incapable of ruling. They're incompetent. Whereas these characters, Putin and Xi, seem to have a pretty good idea of what you have to do to keep things going. Here's the Siloviki versus the neoliberals, right? The two sides that are pulling on Putin. Siloviki, defense, military, Academy of Sciences, KGB, Interior Ministry. Neoliberals, we can call them by name. President Medvedev, who allowed the bombing of Libya. And the Russian ambassador said, Medvedev, you're a traitor. Probably right. First Deputy Prime Minister Shuvalov, Kudrin, the former Treasury Minister, German Gref, another neoliberal, Siluanov is the current finance minister, and Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the Russian Central Bank. Now, as for myself, as we see here, my friendships go with the Siloviki. This is General Ivashov, formerly the Russian Chief of Staff, with me at the Axis for Peace conference in Brussels back in November 2005. I say, among nationalists, you can get along. But when you get those neoliberals and the Wall Street guys in there, then it doesn't work. Now, here's the interesting figure that I call to your attention, fearing that Amy Goodman has not done so. This is Sergei Glaziev. He is an advisor to Putin, so he's a wing of the Kremlin. His big idea is stop using the dollar completely, use the ruble in foreign trade. If the US sanctions you, he says, start selling treasuries. They've got about $500 billion. If they dump them, big problems for the US. He also says, if you sanction us, we're going to have to default on our dollar loans. We're gonna repudiate them. And the next 2 points I think are absolutely critical and deserve to be imitated. He says, if the Western banks, Europe and US, cut off loans to Russia, what we've got to do is direct the Russian central bank to obey the public interest, not the banker interest, put out long-term, low-interest loans from the central bank through the VEB, one of the quasi-state-controlled Russian banks. Use that for manufacturing, agriculture, infrastructure, and trade. Now, that would be the end of the private central bank system, which is the bane and the torment of the entire world, starting with Russia. The other thing he says is, a little bit less directly than I'm putting it here, but capital controls and exchange controls. In other words, don't let the US and the British organize a panic flight out of the ruble, put up a barrier in the way that Malaysia did under Mahathir Mohamad back during the Asian contagion. He's learned that lesson. I would also add, you better get your BRICS development bank going, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. You've got to have something like an alternative to the World Bank. And when you add it all up, this Glaziev may indeed be the dirigist gravedigger of the entire globalized financial system of the past 25 years. And it's about time, because that system has failed. Russia by itself is big enough and important enough and has a specific weight that allows it to essentially bring down the old system. And I want this to happen as soon as possible. I urge everybody to be familiar with Glaziev and support him in any way you can. Now the bad guys. Medvedev, the former president, right? He refused to veto the bombing of Libya, was called a traitor, he deserves it. And sort of from the cultural point of view, he made a big spectacle of Deep Purple. When Deep Purple came to Moscow, he took his son to see them. He's a neoliberal. He's also, this is a recent speech, this is from late April to the Duma. The debate was, since there are going to be sanctions, and there already are sanctions, should you change your economic policy? And I won't read you this entire quote, but he says, we're not going to change because the laws of economics remain universal. What he means by that is Milton Friedman and von Hayek and whatever synthesis they've got, all of that has to be respected no matter what London and New York may try to do to you. So don't change, continue the economic strategy we have chosen. And the crickets mean that the Duma sat there in cold, stony silence. So what it means is Medvedev is politically isolated. He's out of touch. He has not caught the mentality of the Russian people. Here's German Gref, the current head of Sberbank, and he's the former Minister of Economic Development, a neoliberal, thought to be close to Putin. We got to get him less close to Putin. This is Kudrin. I would say Kudrin is the head of this faction, former finance minister. He was fired in 2011 precisely because he didn't want to spend more on military preparedness, because he said that violated, Milton Friedman and the Austrian school or whatever it was. Siluanov is the current finance minister and a dyed-in-the-wool neoliberal. Now, we add this all up. If we take Putin and China and Assad and Sisi and Tsipras, we know that they're all going to be called oppressors by the Anglo-Americans, but I think we can see the outlines of the successful 20th century modern state. It is not liberal, neoliberal. It's anti-neoliberal, anti-monetarist. It's not Thatcher. It's not Reagan. It's dirigistic. De Gaulle, Hamilton, Lincoln, so forth. It goes for protectionism, mercantilism. It's probably going to be called state capitalism, although I think that's not exactly accurate. It will focus on great projects of modern infrastructure, as the Tennessee Valley Authority did under Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's going to require the nationalization of the central bank system. The private central banks, controlled by bankers only, are finished. And it will be mildly authoritarian in many parts of the world, simply because the CIA has destabilized and threatened civilization in so many parts of the world. The New York Times version of it is autocracy. If you picked up the editorial page of the New York Times on May 30th, you'll see that you have David Brooks raving about autocracy, and the editorial page saying, autocracy is on the march in Thailand. I think that means that Thailand is gravitating towards China, therefore they're autocratic. And notice that whatever people at Left Forum thought might have come out of this, when you get out of globalization, if you're going to succeed, you better not go small, you better go big. And that is what we see with these deals. Now, why should we regard Putin and company in a positive way? One thing is that this phase of total U.S. world domination has brought out the absolute worst in the U.S. ruling class. And since we, with our movement inside this country, are not able to restrain neocons or humanitarian bombers, we need a powerful force out there in the world that does have the ability to deter, dissuade, blunt the aggression and the excesses of these US and British neocons, and the humanitarian bombers, and the responsibility to protect crowd. Just remember, when the Soviet Union was strong, real wages were higher here in the United States. The one thing that Putin does not have, and this is my constant theme, he doesn't have an alternative to neoliberal economics. Now, I would even go further. You better not just see the advantages. Why not have a US-Russian condominium? It seemed to be close on Syria last September. Basics would be, Ukraine and the Baltic states should be neutral. Saudi fighters should get out of Syria. We've got to solve the Israeli-Palestine question. If these two parties continue to squabble, it's going to have to be imposed, because we can't have the world blown up over these tiny issues. Same thing for China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands. We're not interested in World War III over those godforsaken pieces of rocks. The North Pole and the South Pole have got to be responsibly managed, not through some kind of conflict. We've got to get the space program going again. Science, right? We've got to keep the ITER fusion demonstration project in southern France going. We've even got the proposal on the table for a China, Russia, Canada, US fast rail. I think it's shameful that the United States didn't come forward with that, and it was left to the Chinese to do so. Now, trying to wrap up in the time we've got. Mass strike, I promised you a mass strike upsurge in 2015. I continue to do so. What you see in Ukraine, but also in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Romania, where the European elections represented a left turn, I think this also shows the old mole of the mass strike continues to burrow underground. But especially in eastern Ukraine, the people who are fighting fascism in eastern Ukraine are workers, right? Those are industrial workers, coal miners, steel workers, and so forth. So I think you can classify that as a mass strike. I mentioned Syriza at the very beginning. I hope it means the end of austerity in Europe. Here's a guy who went from 4% of the votes in 2012. Now he's got 30%. He's going to take over the government in Athens if an election is held. His program is no to austerity, roll it back, have a new London debt conference to essentially write down half or two-thirds of the debt of many of these countries. What he shows you is that the winning formula is the Tsipras-Syriza formula. The Occupy Wall Street formula is a loser. Because look at Syriza goes with program, organization, leadership, strategy, all the things that the Zuccotti honchos told you were wrong, that you shouldn't want. He's going to have about 50 members of the European Parliament. He can work that way too. But the main thing is Prime Minister Tsipras of Athens. That's going to change the world. So much so that you got to think, what will NATO do? It's easy for NATO to have Turkey pick a fight with Greece over some island in the Aegean or some other issue, Cyprus, whatever it is. And the word is that Tsipras has already reached out to Putin saying, look, if Turkey attacks me, will you, Russia, come to my aid? Now that's already, again, a conflict between a NATO state and Russia. Very, very dangerous. But we're now at this level. So I would advise Tsipras to look at his security. So here's Tsipras, again, the man of the hour, and he's been able to put this stuff together. And remember, this is the opposite of Occupy. This is not the continuation. Now, here's another version. You remember that before there was Occupy, there was the Indignados of Spain, right? The Puerta del Sol. Okay, Amy Goodman probably didn't tell you this one either. But this is the Podemos party of Spain. And they are veterans. They are reformed and reconstructed Occupy of the Indignados. And you can see, here's the leader. His name is Pablo Iglesias. Claro que Podemos is your hashtag. This is a political party created in 90 days. So they went from 0 to 8% of the vote in 90 days. And they all come out of this movement. The guy we're looking at here, Iglesias, is a former communist. This is similar to Tsipras. They seem to have a sense of an organization. We need such people. 8% of the vote, 5 members of the European Parliament. And my question is, if Podemos can do that there, why can it not be done here? Now what's going on here is the Tax Wall Street Party, which I have the honor to represent. We have the World Austerity Report. This is available at our desk at the Left Forum. World Austerity Report. So we're trying to keep up with the entire development of these austerity policies worldwide. And I urge you, get this on the internet, right? Sign up, subscribe. It's available in electronic forms and so forth. Specifically, we have a candidate of the Tax Wall Street Party, Dan Burdorf, B-U-H-R-D-O-R-F, as you see here, running for United States Senate in Nebraska. The policy, similar to what we've been talking about, roll back austerity cuts, roll back layoffs, go with the Wall Street sales tax, solve your fiscal problems, deprivatize the Federal Reserve, and then $5 trillion in immediate 0% 100-year credit for infrastructure to begin with. Here's Dan Burdorf, the Tax Wall Street Party candidate. I urge you to support him running for Senate in Nebraska. And here's his opponent, Ben Sasse. Ben Sasse says he was the interface of the CIA, the FBI, and the Department of Justice, but he's still a Tea Party everyman. This is now the Republican candidate. It turns out that over the past 20 years, this guy Sasse has been repeatedly introducing himself as the as the next president of the United States. He says, hello, I'm the 45th president of the United States running as a Republican. Now what does that tell us, right? We know that Carter was prepared in advance. Obama, as I've written about, surely prepared in advance. It may be that 2.5 years before the November 2016 election, we've identified here, and you can look at his face, the Manchurian candidate of the Wall Street banking community who's going to come out of nowhere in the Carter-Obama mode and make it all change. Now, he's also got a problem. It's called Pagegate. He was a proctor for the House Pages. And it goes back to 1996, 1998, when Congressman Mark Foley and Congressman Jim Colba were in there molesting these kids. His job was to prevent that from happening. It has happened. We've also got a sex scandal at the university where he was the president until quite recently. So it looks like he's either a participant in something unsavory, or he's a front man for unsavory activities. Now, since we had in the past week the apotheosis of Snowden once again, if you see somebody who gets on the front page of the Washington Post and then gets a whole evening on NBC News, I'm afraid you got to conclude this character is a ruling class asset. And that would be Snowden, as you see here, a troubled individual. The best analysis we have comes from Wayne Madsen, which is that this guy represents the CIA trying to prevent the NSA from monitoring the activities of the CIA. When he goes on television, as he did this week, he said, I'm from the CIA, the NSA, and the DIA, that he was a lecturer for the DIA. And he has repeated in all these appearances, I'm still working for the US federal government. And I would have to say, yes, I believe you are, in precisely the obvious sense. His program seems to be privatizing surveillance, that it's okay for Google to know, but not the NSA. Finally, remember my limited Hangout giveaways. If the whistleblower becomes a media darling when other whistleblowers are ignored, it may be a limited Hangout. If there's a Damascus Road conversion, we know that Snowden said anybody who leaks should be shot in the testicles. Well, that doesn't look good either. If the guy doesn't tell you anything new, because all of this was known, it's all in the Patriot Act, and nothing big, nothing about the JFK assassination, the 9/11 attacks, Iran-Contra, color revolutions, other activities, well, that doesn't inspire confidence. If no top careers are destroyed, and if new covert operations, Ellsberg prepares Watergate, Assange prepares the 2011 Arab Spring. And then if the cheerleaders get prestigious careers, from Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, the publicity team for Ellsberg, to today Greenwald and Poitras, the publicity team for Snowden, all of this adds up to a very suspicious and disturbing picture. And since we've mentioned Assange, here's Assange. This, by the way, is in the MK Ultra Anne Hamilton burn cult in Australia. He has now said, Assange has the merit of saying that Greenwald is attempting to hoard and censor documents, obviously because that's the stock in trade of Greenwald, right? That's his capital investment. And finally, I just wanted to remind you, the libertarians are no alternative. Remember Ron Paul and his Ron Paul newsletters full of racism for many years, and he claimed that he didn't know. That's not good enough. And Ron Paul, representative of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of Freemasons. So in conclusion, we invite you to join with the United Front Against Austerity, with the Tax Wall Street Party, to support candidacies like those of Dan Burdorf in Nebraska. We would also like you to take a look at Randy Credico running for governor against Cuomo in the Democratic primary in the state of New York, and other meritorious candidates that you can find at our website. So again, Tax Wall Street Party and United Front Against Austerity, and thank you very much.